For many years, researchers AK Wilks, Doug Oswell, and Zander Kite have explored the possibility that the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, may have been responsible for the crimes of the Zodiac Killer. Kaczynski was a gifted mathematician who had a successful academic career but became a domestic terrorist, murdering and injuring people using mail bombs. Doug Oswell's book, The Unabomber and the Zodiac, presents his findings, highlighting the similarities between the Unabomber and Zodiac. Zander Kite and AK Wilks developed a grid-based method of extracting supposed hidden messages from various names and phrases. They found ways to connect Theodore Kaczynski to not only the Zodiac Killer case, but a variety of other unsolved crimes. Many years ago, AK Wilks invited me to a Zodiac Killer forum to discuss their theories and decipherments. Recently, he reached out to me to look at their recent work linking Kaczynski to several unsolved cases. They have a lot of ideas about why Kaczynski is connected to Zodiac and these other cases. In this video, let's do a deep dive into their decipherment methods, where words and names are Caesar shifted into a grid format where hidden messages can be found. To understand their system, let's get to the basics. What is Caesar shifting? It's based on an ancient way of making ciphers called the Caesar cipher, which was used by Roman general and dictator Julius Caesar well over 2,000 years ago. It's a very simple method of hiding messages. First, you take a normal alphabet, A through Z, call it the plaintext alphabet. Then write another alphabet above it, call that the cipher alphabet. Now you need a shift value, which is just a number. Let's say our shift value is +1. This just means we will add 1 to our plaintext letters, which is the same as sliding the cipher alphabet 1 position to the left. So now, A plus 1 becomes B, B plus 1 becomes C, C plus 1 becomes D, and so on. Also, notice that when the letter A fell off the end of the cipher alphabet, it wrapped back around to the right-hand side, so Z plus 1 becomes A. Now you can encrypt a message by replacing the plaintext letters with ciphertext letters. For example, if the plaintext word is dog, then we see the ciphertext letter for D is E, the letter for O is P, and the letter for G is H. This gives us the ciphertext EPH. To decrypt that, we just reverse the process. Letter E is D, letter P is O, and H is G. AK Wilks and Zander Kite used this Caesar shifting method as the basis for their grid format. Here's how they made a Caesar shift grid using the Unabomber's last name, Kaczynski. First, they wrote Kaczynski. It's 9 letters long, so the grid has 9 columns of letters in it. Let's call this row the reference row. Next, they decided to use shift values that are multiples of 10. They started with a shift value of +10 to add a new row above the grid. So here's what we get when we add 10 to each of the letters in Kaczynski. Next, they used a shift value of +20 to add another row above the grid. In this row, we add 20 to each of the letters in Kaczynski. Then they added another new row using a shift value of 30. Next, they added new rows below the grid. Their first shift value was -10, so we subtract 10 from each of the letters in Kaczynski. The next one was -20, so we subtract 20 to get this new row. Then finally, subtract 30 to get this last row on the bottom. Now we have their Caesar shift grid based on the name Kaczynski, with all these new letters that are shifted from it using these multiples of 10. AK Wilks and Zander Kite used this grid to find some interesting links between the name Kaczynski and an old mass murder case. On June 25, 1968, the entire Robison family from Detroit, Michigan was murdered while vacationing at their Lake Michigan cottage. The husband, wife, and their 4 kids were brutally killed with a rifle and hammer. There was a prime suspect, Joseph Raymond Scalaro III, who was an embezzling employee of the husband, but no charges were filed. He ended up committing suicide, which put the case in the inactive file. The Detroit News wanted to help solve various crimes and began a secret witness program. The paper encouraged informants to give information anonymously and offered cash rewards for any convictions resulting from the information. One informant responded saying he had information about the Robison case, but wouldn't give it until the police published a specific and strange classified ad in the newspaper, which they did. The bizarre message was, "Dr. Guidini, your prescription good. However, need additional." Signed, Zodius. Evidently, no one was ever able to figure out the meaning of the message, or the unusual names Guidini and Zodius, and the informant didn't deliver any more information about the case. Here is AK Wilks and Zander Kite's Caesar shift grid again. Let's look at how they connected to this case. The reference line contains the Unabomber's name, Kaczynski. As I mentioned before, these shift values are multiples of 10, producing these other rows of letters that are shifted from the letters in Kaczynski. Reading along columns, we can find the word Guidini. Referencing the Dr. Guidini from the classified ad, we can also find the word Zodius, the mysterious signature from the ad. And surprisingly, the word Zodiac also appears. So this cipher grid appears to connect the name of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, with the Robison murder case by referencing the unusual names Guidini and Zodius. At the same time, it appears to reference the Zodiac case. This seems remarkable. Did Theodore Kaczynski design this cipher grid to reference his involvement with both the Zodiac crimes and the Robison family murders? Did he use it to develop the aliases he used in his crimes? Well, the first problem is that this kind of grid allows for a lot of freedom to search for interesting things. When reading along columns, you can pick letters from any row. So for the same grid, you can find other words, such as emporium, guide dog, stories, and Easters. In fact, using this method, you can find over 5,000 words that are at least 3 letters long. You can also find lots of names appearing in this grid, such as Vince, Austin, Kaspersky, Dorsey, Spence, and Tanya. I mean, I could pick any 3 words or names from Kaczynski's grid and come up with a context or a story that makes them seem important or connected. For instance, the serial killer Ed Kemper can be found. Maybe Kaczynski was involved with him. Did Kaczynski have a connection to Gastonia, North Carolina? Or Astoria, the city in Oregon? Who is Kaspersky? Is it Leon Kaspersky, a top science student who ran a student newspaper which featured articles critical of the US? Perhaps Kaczynski found a kindred spirit considering his own critical views of industry and technology. Who are Austin May, Kay Dorsey, and Gus Ponce? Possible victims or planned victims? Accomplices? Guiderius is a character in a Shakespeare play. He was the kidnapped son of a king who grows up to be courageous and discovers his true royal identity. Was Kaczynski inspired by this character? Kaczynski made bombs with a wide variety of materials. Actinium is a highly radioactive element. Was he planning to use this as part of his bomb designs? How do we know which of these words and names to keep and which ones to ignore? It's really all in the eye of the beholder. Let's look at this from another angle. So we know that Kaczynski's grid can produce Guidini, Zodiac, and Zodius. How many other names or words also produce those same 3 words with the same grid setup? Turns out quite a lot. For example, here's the grid for Austin May. You can find Guidini as well as Zodiac and Zodius. Check out Don Master's grid. There's Guidini and Zodiac and Zodius. Some more examples are Vince Stone, Ricky Tataki, Weston Mason, Alvin Cachero, and Don McDonald. There are hundreds more names of various lengths. Those same hidden words appear for words and phrases as well. Here's the grid for the word custodies, where you can find Guidini, Zodiac, and Zodius. Podcasters' works too. Some more examples are Zen Masters, Good Ideas, Wicked Ideas, Accosted Each, and Dense Mystery. The full list contains thousands of matches. Guidini, Zodiac, and Zodius aren't the only interesting words we could look for. What if there was a man named Oliver Norman who decided, I want to target victims whose names appear in my Caesar-shifted grid? Well, let's take a look at his grid. The 3 female Zodiac victims are Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Farron, and Cecilia Shepard. All 3 names appear in his grid. If someone didn't know any better, they might use this grid to implicate whoever this Oliver Norman fellow might be. But those 3 victim names also appear in grids for other people. For example, David Allen Henderson, Rachel Ann Ryan, Donovan Nixon, and Antonio DeJarnette. If we spend enough time, we can find lots of hidden words and pick ones that seem important to us. But they're just appearing by chance. How can you possibly work out which words were intentionally put there by someone? Here's another angle. If you put all the words together, you can even make them say full sentences. Here are some examples. As for me, I once was to die in quite a storm in Gastonia. It's quite fun if Vince's wife dies on Easter. I've put 2 torsos in Tanya's east room. Eesh, that's creepy. Of course, Theodore Kaczynski isn't the only Zodiac suspect. Can we use this same grid system to find connections between other people and Zodiac? David Muggrease was a murderer suspected of killing David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. If we look at his name in the Caesar shift grid, it turns out the word Zodiac appears. And there are other Zodiac references in there. A KVON radio station reporter found the payphone Zodiac called from after his Lake Berryessa attack. Here's RCC, or Riverside City College, where possible Zodiac victim Sherry Jo Bates was killed. You can find the word clue, C-L-E-W, Zodiac's misspelling of clue, and Mag-N, or Magnetic North, the instruction he included in his Mount Diablo code. And here's the word meanies, which is like blue meanies, the Beatles villains Zodiac uses to refer to the cops. Blue meanies! Stephen Armenta was a special agent who responded to the Lake Herman Road crime scene with Detective Pierre Bidou. An amateur sleuth claims Bidou was Zodiac and Armenta covered it up. In Armenta's grid, you can find Herman, referring to the crime scene at Lake Herman Road, and David and Jensen, referring to David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, who were killed there. You can even find both Napa and Park Ranger, referring to the Lake Berryessa crime scene, Taxi, referring to cab driver Zodiac victim Paul Stein. Perhaps this Irene is Sherry Jo Bates' mother, Irene Bates. And here's sniping, perhaps one of Zodiac's methods of killing. Charles Clifton Collins was suspected by his son of being Zodiac, but was ruled out with DNA testing. As you might guess, you can find lots of Zodiac connections in his grid. Both spellings of ciphers. Girls, perhaps referring to his victims. Mirror, a part of his bus bomb death machine. Maybe Norse refers to his SLA letter. And pencil, the same misspelling of pencil from his letter. Titwillow makes an appearance. It's from the Mikado, and Zodiac references it in his Exorcist letter. And no matter how many of these hidden messages we've found, the case is still unsolved. You can pretty much do this exercise with most of the Zodiac suspects. Put their name in the grid, and if you look hard enough, you'll discover interesting names and words that link them to the case. It should be pretty obvious by now that whatever we find from this Caesar shift grid method is not reliable as evidence, because so many words, phrases, names, and interpretations are possible, even with a small grid. But why does it generate so many interesting things? Kaczynski is 9 letters long, so the grid is only 9 columns by 7 rows, which gives just 63 letters to pick from. Using this way of finding messages, you can make words as long as 9 letters long and as short as 1 letter. I won't bore you with the math, but there are over 54 million ways for letters in this grid to make possible words by reading left to right and allowing selections from different rows. For example, here's an animation breezing through the 84,035 different ways to look for 5-letter words. Even if only 1% of those are real words, you're still looking at about 840 5-letter words to pick from. In my test, over 1,000 can be found in this grid. Because of this, when we pick something interesting like Guidini, Zodiac, and Zodius, we can't prove it was designed by someone. There are too many other words, names, phrases, and sentences that can be extracted from the same grid. How do we know which ones might have been put there on purpose? I think it's a great example of something known as the look elsewhere effect. Basically, this is an effect where you find something that seems statistically significant, but it only seems important because you didn't test enough stuff. An example similar to the Caesar shift grids is the so-called Bible code featured in several books. In this one, there's an example showing a grid of the original Bible text in Hebrew, but several hidden words appear. Twin can be found vertically, towers along this diagonal, and airplane along a different diagonal pattern. So if you believe this message is real, then Twin Towers airplane could be a prediction of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But the message is happening by chance, like the words we found in the Caesar shift grids because of the look elsewhere effect. Since the Bible text can be read in different directions and different grid shapes, the chances of finding interesting words goes up dramatically, especially when you keep looking. For example, if you take the book of Genesis from the King James Version of the Bible, then rewrite it into this grid format, then you can find wiki and pedia, making the word Wikipedia, along two different diagonals. That doesn't mean the hidden words were special or put there on purpose by a person or some supernatural entity. They just appear by chance. It's like shuffling a deck of cards and dealing out hands until something special comes out, like a straight flush or royal flush, and then telling people that someone or something designed the deck for that to happen. It reminds me of when I look at a clock and it says 11:11. After I see that enough times, it really starts to feel like it happens more often than usual. But thousands of other times I look at a clock and see some other ordinary time, which doesn't stand out in my mind, so I don't count them up to weigh them against the more special times that I see 11:11. After looking at a clock hundreds of times, seeing 11:11 becomes inevitable. But some people infuse 11:11 with much more meaning, such as a message from a higher power, or a connection to a spiritual realm. The letters in the shifted rows of these grids look like random gibberish, but they can make so many readable messages. It's a bit like having enough paint lying around to make all kinds of paintings. By the way, something similar to this look elsewhere effect with the Caesar shift grids or the Bible code was in the news recently. Dennis Rader, the serial killer known as BTK, sent a word search puzzle 20 years ago. And recently someone found more case-related words and names in it. Maybe I'll explore that in a future video, but long story short, people are finding messages in his puzzle that aren't really there. But what if someone did design a Caesar shift grid with a real hidden message in it? If Kaczynski really did hide words in his grid, we still can't prove it without some kind of external evidence, such as discovering that he wrote about it in his journals. Without something like that, we can't prove it, because there's enough reasonable doubt that these messages are just appearing by chance, as I've shown many examples of. The Kaczynski grid's discoverers, Zander Kite and AK Wilks, laid out the grid into 7 rows. The shift values are multiples of 10. I'm not aware of a specific reason why 10 is important in this system, other than it's a nice even number or a good fit with our ordinary use of base 10 numbers. And counting by tens seems very orderly and natural. But we could look at grids with other shift intervals. For example, what if we use multiples of 3? Then we get these sequences involving 3, 6, and 9, and the shifted rows are different from the previous grid. You could even further justify those numbers by saying, look, here they are on the map that came with Zodiac's Mount Diablo code. With this modified grid, now we find different words and names, such as ex-wives, alive, and Eric Beyer. Here's a grid using multiples of 2, so we get shifts of 2, 4, and 6. Now we can find things like maidens, and key value, perhaps referencing a cipher key, and a reference to the Zodiac reporter Paul Avery, and Lake Tahoe, where possible Zodiac victim Donna Lass went missing, or this reference to the Saks Fifth Avenue paper he used for his letters. There's also no reason you couldn't also try shift values that don't use nice multiples. You could use randomly selected numbers, or something that follows some logic like the dates of the first 2 attacks, December 20th and July 4th, giving you 12, 20, 7, and 4, which reveals some interesting messages like rainstorm, and Zodiac suspect Poncho, and the name Emily Rowe. There are still even more ways to adjust the grids. For example, instead of putting the reference line right in the middle, you could move it up or down. If you put the reference line at the top, you can spot Solano, the county where the first 2 Zodiac attacks took place. Here's the word mailed, since Zodiac liked to mail letters to newspapers and the Unabomber liked to mail bombs. And here's a reference to Donald Bujak, a murderer from Montana who some suspected to be Zodiac. Another simple way to change the grids is to add more rows, giving you even more letters to make words with. Adding 2 more to the Kaczynski grid allows for mini boom or agony boom to appear, relevant phrases for the Unabomber. And what about reading backwards? If interesting Zodiac words appear but they're written backwards, wouldn't those still seem significant? In the original Kaczynski grid you can find Sky Ridge backwards, maybe a reference to a relevant place name. Secrets, which the grid seems to hide, and who is Sam Hodge? Let's look at another one of AK Wilks and Zander Kite's discoveries. This has to do with a different case, the Oakland County Child Killer case, where at least 4 children in Oakland County, Michigan were killed between 1976 and 1977. AK Wilks believes that case, too, might have a connection to the Unabomber Theodore Kaczynski. Dr. Bruce Danto, a psychiatrist working on the case, received a letter from someone called Alan, who claimed to be an accomplice in these child killings. The alleged accomplice said he'd give photographic evidence of the child murders, but first Dr. Danto had to publish a special code phrase on the front page of the Sunday newspaper. Weather Bureau say trees to bloom in 3 weeks. That cryptic message did indeed get published as a blurb on the front page about the warm weather on the coming Easter weekend. It said, "If the warming trend persists, trees should be blooming in 3 weeks." Afterwards, the accomplice called and set up a meeting with the psychiatrist, but never showed up and was never heard from again. AK Wilks discovered a Caesar shift grid that turns up something interesting for Allen's code phrase. It uses trees to bloom in weeks as the reference line, then he adds a shifted row above and 4 rows below. They are in multiples of 10. Then if we read left to right, we can spot Theodore Kaczynski, except we have to skip a few columns, reuse this column, and the Z is missing from his last name. It's a little messy, but the name is mostly there. This might seem like a significant finding, but if you took in anything from the analysis of the previous Kaczynski grid, you might suspect that this connection is also happening by chance. So maybe we should check for other names. If a lot of other names appear, then how do we know which one is there by design? Here are some other names I found. Preston Hemingway, Duke Johnson Cook, Jose Carlos Santiago, Tracy Jane Seymour, Houston Ridgway, and Frank Stanley Conway. As you might expect, that's just a small sample. The harder you look, the more names you can find. You can also dig out some names related to the Zodiac case if you look hard enough. R. Dean Kucinich. This could be Ronald Dean Kucinich, a white supremacist who mailed threatening letters in the 1970s and was mentioned on Zodiac forums. Raymond George Gann was questioned by police after the Lake Herman Road murders. Here's Shell Hammond Cavalli, Mike Rodelli's suspect. Raymond Wise, apparently a suspect mentioned in the Lake Berryessa police report. Dennis Kaufman suspected his father, Jack Terrence. You can even see Gary Stewart's father, Earl Van Best Jr., if you squint a little. Here's Joseph Bates, the father of possible Zodiac victim Sherry Jo Bates. Astoundingly, our friend and fellow Z340 codebreaker, Jarl Van Eyck, appears in this grid. So does Darlene Farron's husband, Dean Farron. It's really interesting how many names you can spot in this grid, and it's not just names. Here are some interesting phrases. Porterhouse steaks, police or racist cooks. The key to break it is gouge. That seems to be talking about breaking a cipher. Theo, you are so anxious. The key, Louis's Zodiac. Is this referring to Zodiac suspect Louis Myers? Treacherous times. These terrors seize us. They speak no language. And here are some Zodiac-related phrases. Photoelectric switch. A component of his death machine. Diablo code key. This makes me think of Zodiac's Mount Diablo code. Threatening Coco. Coco was the Lord High Executioner in The Mikado, the play Zodiac liked to reference. Boo, you are doomed. That's straight out of Zodiac's Halloween card where he says, Peekaboo, you are doomed. There's another way to test this Caesar shift grid approach. We can find the name Theodore Kaczynski in the phrase trees to bloom in weeks, but what about in other phrases? Of course, there are loads of phrases where you can find Kaczynski's full name using the same grid setup. Here's a very small sample. Her eyes don't say. Hostile spirits. The crowning act. Their own bodies. Dreadful stories. He hears low cries. New blood moves today. The dearest of friends. Very tired of sitting by her. The knife sticks. These phrases are even more specific to Kaczynski. The professor saw. Ted was a professor at UC Berkeley. He teaches mathematics. Ted was a math prodigy and taught it at Berkeley. The everlasting mail. This reflects the fact that he mailed bombs to victims. And bombs bursting in air. One of his bombs almost blew up an airplane. Out of curiosity, I wanted to know if anything shifted to Unabomber. I found plenty of names like Dirk Fowler, Gene Beaver, Gina Bowler, Kirk Vogler, Laura Bigler, Wayne Rempel, And these phrases also shift to Unabomber. Died November, Divine Reaper, More Fearful, Alcoholic Beverage, I Have a Letter, I Have Murdered, Died Hereafter, and I Have a File. All of those numerous results were found using these specific shift values, 1 row above and 4 rows below. We haven't even changed any of those details and still extracted a wide variety of hidden messages. Imagine how many more we can find if we change these shift values or modify the number or position of shifted rows or read messages backwards. Finally, let's look at a third grid from AK Wilks. This one uses the full name Theodore J. Kaczynski and 8 shifted rows, making the grid taller than the previous 2. In this grid you can find Zodiac and Zodius, just like before in the grid that only says Kaczynski. But in this grid you can also find the unusual name Robert. Supposedly this is a reference to a mysterious religious medal that was found around Richard Robison's neck when he and the rest of his family were found murdered. On the back of the medal was this engraving: Richard, to my chosen son and heir, God bless you, Robert. Under the mysterious name Robert were 3 dots under the middle letters EBE. AK Wilks points out an interesting coincidence, that the unsolved ending of Zodiac's first cipher decodes to the same letters, EBE. Who was Robert? Did he have something to do with the murders of the Robison couple and their 4 children? Did the perpetrator use this name because it appears in this Caesar-shifted grid based on the Unabomber's name, Theodore J. Kaczynski? Once again, you should be skeptical. The grid looks like a bunch of random letters, but the real secret it's hiding is that you can find so many things if you look hard enough for them. Check this out. You can make this grid predict the 9/11 attacks. In September, on the 11th day, the United States experienced Islamist suicide attacks of terrorism, a jihad by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, who crashed airplanes into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in the city of New York. One hijacked plane targeted Washington, D.C., but it crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Another plane struck the Pentagon building in Arlington, Virginia. Al-Qaeda's leader was Osama bin Laden, who issued 2 fatwa, or religious decrees, in the late 1990s. The US thought Iraq and its leader Saddam Hussein were involved in the attacks. Bin Laden hid in Pakistan, where the US found and killed him. Mohammed Atta was the pilot who flew the first plane into the North Tower. Soon after, another plane crashed into the South Tower. The US killed another Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who replaced bin Laden after his death. And bin Laden had been killed by SEAL Team 6. One of the Navy SEALs on that team was Robert J. O'Neill. The Unabomber was indeed a terrorist, but I don't think he would have taken any credit for 9/11. In hindsight, maybe I should have used a happier example. How about Dr. Seuss? I'll leave that as a challenge for you all. What can you find in the grid that fits that theme? As before, we can flip this analysis around to see how many names besides Kaczynski produce the words Robert, Zodiac, and Zodius. Some examples are Reginald Daniels, Leonardo Jennings, Rosalind Bradshaw. There were lots of short names that worked too. The words show up stacked together. Ben Egbert, Diane Gold, Dwayne Kent, Lee Hewitt, and Ted Nugent. The same words even show up for Zodiac victim Darlene Ferrin, and for other people mentioned as suspects on Zodiac forums. David Carpenter, the Trailside Killer, the murderer Taylor Tiford, a Hollywood entertainer's son, Robert Linkletter, and Victor Wilde, a man with a possible connection to Charles Manson. Those 3 words even appear in words that seem very much related to the Unabomber, like detonated, obliterated, abduction murder, and exploding bridge wire. I think I've harped on this for far too long. If you've made it this far, I salute you. It should be pretty obvious at this point that the Caesar shift grid by itself can't be used as evidence of some link between people and crimes. On the other hand, if someone discovered a Caesar shift grid written in a suspect's journals or letters, then we'd really need to pay close attention to what they might be trying to do with it. I want to thank AK Wilks for sharing his research with me and being open to me making a video about it. Even though I don't find these encoded discoveries convincing, I was fascinated by them and enjoyed exploring ways to answer questions about their significance. If Kaczynski somehow really did put those hidden messages in the grid on purpose, we can't prove that they are real because so many other words, names, and phrases appear just by chance. There are simply too many degrees of freedom in this kind of grid. Remember the game called Boggle? You shake these 16 dice which settle into a 4x4 grid with 16 letters. Then you write down words you can find in the grid by connecting letters in any direction. Even with so few letters, these grids have tons of words in them. For example, a programmer found that the Boggle grid with these letters has almost 1,500 valid words hidden in it. Boggle doesn't follow the same rules as the Caesar shift cipher, but it shows how simple rules on a small pile of letters can produce many messages. I don't mean to discourage people who are trying to crack codes and find secret messages. It's just that there's a lot of homework to do to make sure you're on the right track. Not many people are willing to do it. That's why when people send me their code work, I often can't reply with an analysis. Testing their ideas and demonstrating these kinds of problems are very time-consuming and labor-intensive. I hope this video gets people to be more aware of the common traps of code breaking and extracting information that seems real but isn't. Watch out for bottomless rabbit holes. I wouldn't want someone to make a false connection, like using a person's name to implicate them in a crime they might not have committed. Even my own name links to Zodiac victim David Faraday, and Zodiac's messages by rope and by fire, and the bomb is made. My name even links to Paul Avery, Chronicle reporter. Here's a grid with simple shifts of 1 and 2, where Zodiac shows up from my last name. This one uses shifts with multiples of 4, where Zodiac also appears. And this one using multiples of 9, where you can see Zodiac quite plainly. Don't get any ideas though. I'm not the damned Zodiac.
I'm not the damn Zodiac.